Edmund Burke's core beliefs. Burke is best understood as the founder of modern conservatism, but not in a simplistic anti-change sense. His thinking is about how change should happen without destroying the social fabric. 1. Society is an organic inheritance, not a contract you redesign. Society is a living system built over generations, not something you can rebuild from scratch. He famously described it as a partnership between the dead, the living, and the unborn. Institutions of family, church, monarchy, customs exist because they've worked over time, not because they pass a logical test. 2. Tradition is functional, not irrational. Burke defended it as inherited wisdom. People don't have the time or capacity to rationally rederive everything because tradition stores knowledge. Destroying tradition in favor of pure reason is to him dangerously naive. 3. Gradual reform versus radical change. Burke was not anti-change. He supported reform, but change must be incremental, rooted in existing institutions and respectful of social continuity. Sudden, abstract redesign, he believed, was instability, violence, and unintended consequences. 4. Skepticism of abstract rights. Burke did not deny rights, but rejected abstract universal rights, detached from context. Rights are inherited, practiced, and embedded in a specific society. Political theory should follow reality, not override it. 5. Order, hierarchy, and restraint are necessary for liberty. He believed freedom without structure becomes chaos. Social hierarchy provides stability. Liberty depends on moral norms, social discipline, and institutional continuity. 6. Religion and moral culture are politically essential. Religion is not just private belief. It's a foundation of social order. A society that abandons moral restraint in favor of pure rationalism becomes unstable. 7. Critique of the French Revolution. Burke saw it as an attempt to rebuild society from abstract principles, a rejection of tradition, religion, and hierarchy. He predicted correctly. It would lead to violence, tyranny, and social breakdown. John Locke versus Burke. Agreement and conflict. Where they agree. 1. Government is not absolute. Both reject divine right monarchy. Power must be limited and justified. 2. Legitimacy matters. Government must serve the people in some meaningful sense. Arbitrary rule is illegitimate. 3. Property is central. To Locke, property is a natural right. To Burke, property is foundational to stability and order. 4. Revolution is sometimes justified. For Locke, when rights are violated. For Burke, in extreme, concrete cases of abuse. He supported the American cause. Where they fundamentally disagree. 1. Individual versus society. Locke begins with the individual in a state of nature. Burke begins with historical society as already formed. So Locke builds society up from individuals, whereas Burke understands individuals through society. 2. Nature of rights. For Locke, rights are natural, universal, pre-political. For Burke, rights are inherited, contextual, and socially embedded. 3. Role of reason. To Locke, reason can design legitimate government. To Burke, reason is limited. Tradition is wiser than theory, so Locke trusts rational construction, whereas Burke trusts accumulated experience. 4. Attitude toward political change. Locke was more open to refounding systems if they violate rights. Burke strongly favors gradual reform within tradition, so Locke tolerates resets, whereas Burke fears them. 5. View of equality. For Locke, moral equality of individuals is foundational. Burke accepts inequality and hierarchy as natural and stabilizing. 6. View of the social contract. Locke believed in a foundational agreement, even if theoretical. Burke thought it a misleading abstraction. Society is not something people just sign into. So Locke gives you the blueprint for legitimate government through rights, consent, and limits on power. Burke gives you the blueprint for stable civilization through tradition, continuity, restraint, and gradualism. At a surface level, Edmund Burke and John Locke can look compatible. Both reject absolute monarchy, both think power must be limited, both value property, and neither defends arbitrary tyranny. But they are actually starting from different foundations of political reality, and that leads them in meaningfully different directions. Locke's philosophy begins with a kind of thought experiment where individuals exist prior to society in a state of nature, possessing natural rights to life, liberty, and property, and they form governments. Through consent to protect those rights, even if the state of nature is hypothetical, the point is that the individual is logically and morally prior to society, and political authority is justified only insofar as it secures those pre-existing rights. which is why Locke is comfortable saying that if a government systematically violates them, people are justified in overthrowing it. Burke, by contrast, rejects that entire framing as too abstract and detached from reality. For him, human beings are never actually individuals first and society second, but are born into dense networks of family, culture, religion, and inherited institutions that shape their identity and moral understanding long before they can reason about rights. So instead of asking, what rights do individuals have before society, he asks what kind of inherited social order has proven over time to sustain a functioning civilization. And his answer is that tradition, custom, and long-standing institutions embody a kind of accumulated wisdom that no single generation, no matter how rational it thinks it is, can successfully reconstruct from scratch. This is why Burke defends things like monarchy, aristocracy, and the church, not necessarily because each is perfect in principle, but because they are products of historical evolution, and tearing them down in the name of abstract equality or rational design, as he believed happened in the French Revolution, risked destroying the delicate, often invisible preconditions that make liberty itself possible. In his view, freedom is not simply the absence of constraint guaranteed by rights, but a social achievement that depends on order, hierarchy, moral discipline, and continuity, all of which are sustained by tradition rather than invented by reason. So while Locke tends to trust that human reason can identify just principles and build political systems around them, Burke is deeply skeptical of that confidence. He believes reason is limited, that people overestimate their ability to redesign complex systems, and that what looks like irrational hierarchies are often actually compressed social knowledge that keeps society stable. This difference shows up sharply in their attitudes toward change. Locke's framework allows for relatively clean breaks. If a government violates rights, it loses legitimacy and can be replaced, whereas Burke insists that even when reform is necessary, it must be gradual, cautious, and rooted in existing institutions, because sudden attempts to rebuild society according to theory tend to unleash chaos and, paradoxically, lead to tyranny rather than freedom. They also diverge on rights themselves. Locke treats rights as universal and pre-political, applying equally to all individuals in principle, while Burke sees rights as inherited and contextual, shaped by a particular legal and cultural tradition, and is wary of claims about universal rights detached from concrete institutions that can actually sustain them. So the real disagreement isn't just a small extension from Locke to Burke, it's a shift in what counts as the foundation of politics. Locke builds upward from the individual and trusts in rational principles to justify authority, while Burke builds outward from historical society and trusts in evolved institutions to preserve order and make liberty workable. Burke is concerned with governance. He's implicitly challenging the idea that politics can be grounded in abstract individualism at all, arguing instead that if you start there and ignore tradition, you may end up undermining the very conditions that make individual rights meaningful in the first place. The intellectual backbone of the Revolution and founding documents is unmistakably Lockean. The Declaration of Independence is basically a distilled version of John Locke, with natural rights of life, liberty, and property. Government by consent, with the right to overthrow unjust rule. Government exists to protect pre-existing rights, not to define them. But the system they built looks surprisingly Burkean. Once independence was won, the founders did not try to rebuild society from scratch. The United States Constitution reflects a lot of instincts that Edmond Burke would recognize, like preservation of English common law traditions, the gradual institutional continuity like courts, legislatures, and property systems, suspicion of radical democracy, hence checks and balances, Senate, and the Electoral College, and the emphasis on order, stability, and slow change. The clearest way to understand America is that it was founded on a Lockean claim about legitimacy, but governed through a Burkean instinct about continuity. Locke tells you why government has any right to exist at all. Individuals possess rights prior to the state. Government is created by consent, and when it becomes destructive of those rights, it loses legitimacy. That is the language of the Declaration, and it is the moral grammar of the Revolution. Burke, on the other hand, tells you how a real people can remain free without dissolving into chaos. Liberty has to live inside inherited institutions, habits, religion, local loyalties, and gradual reform, because people are not abstract atoms who can simply invent a working civilization on paper. America ended up combining those two things. It justified separation from Britain in Lockean terms, but it did not try to erase the whole inherited social world. It kept English common law, bicameral legislatures, jury trials, property rules, local government, and a general respect for continuity. So the American system was never pure abstract individualism. It was individual rights, housed inside an old civilizational structure. That is why the tension keeps reappearing in every major American crisis. The Lockean side of America says that if a law, institution, or tradition violates basic rights, it is illegitimate and may have to be broken. The Burkean side says that even when something is wrong, destroying the whole social order in the name of justice can unleash worse evils, so reform should be slow, prudent, and conscious of consequences. In peaceful times, those two instincts can coexist pretty well. In crisis, they collide. Leave a comment on where you side most. In an American sense, Burke's influence became the conservative instinct to preserve the Constitution as an inherited structure of ordered liberty, not as a blank piece of paper that every generation can rewrite according to its latest theory. Burke did not help draft the Constitution, but his philosophy fits the American constitutional tradition because he believed freedom survives only when it is protected by durable institutions, habits, restraints, and inherited wisdom. In his speech on America, Burke argued that Britain was endangering its own constitutional spirit by denying Americans their traditional liberties, warning that trying to prove Americans had no rights would subvert the maxims, preserving British liberty itself. That is very close to the later American conservative view that the Constitution is not just a legal document, but that it is a civilizational inheritance. It carries principles tested by experience: separation of powers, federalism, rule of law, due process, property rights, representative government, and limits on popular passion. A Burkean would say, those things should be conserved because they restrain both tyranny from above and mob rule from below. Burke's famous idea that society is a partnership between the living, the dead, and the unborn gives the Constitution a sacred intergenerational meaning. Americans inherited a constitutional order from the founders, are responsible for maintaining it, and must pass it on without mutilating it for short-term political passions. So Burkean conservatism in America becomes the argument that liberty is not preserved by constant revolution, but by reverence for the institutions that make liberty possible. Locke gives the rights. Burke explains why those rights need constitutional walls around them. The American conservative synthesis is basically natural rights plus inherited constitutional order. Burke would not say to never change anything. He supported reform, but he would say reform must be careful, constitutional, historically aware, and respectful of the accumulated wisdom inside the system. That is why his thought became so useful to American conservatism. It defends the Constitution not merely as old paper, but as the living framework that prevents freedom from collapsing into either bureaucratic tyranny or revolutionary chaos.